Hi, I'm Siren. Softest Siren because I turned and faced the strange. It's time to embrace a Kafka-esque view on life. The Metamorphosis is a terrible conception, a terrible dream. And in his own words, the dream reveals a reality which conception lags behind. That is the horror of life, the terror of art. And now I give you Franz Kafka's 1915 disturbing short story, The Metamorphosis. 1. When Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous insect. He was lying on his back, which was hard, as if plated in armor, and when he lifted his head slightly, he could see his belly. Rounded, brown, and divided into stiff, arched segments. On top of it, the blanket, about to slip off altogether, still barely clinging. His many legs, which seemed pathetically thin when compared to the rest of his body, flickered helplessly before his eyes. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It was no dream. His room, a normal though somewhat small human bedroom, lay quietly within its four familiar walls. Above the table on which his unpacked fabric samples were spread, Samsa was a traveling salesman. Hung the picture he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and had set in a lovely gilt frame. It showed a lady wearing a fur hat and a fur stole, sitting upright and thrusting out to the viewer a thick fur muff, into which her whole forearm had disappeared. Gregor's glance then fell on the window and the overcast sky. One could hear raindrops drumming on the tin sheeting of the windowsill. Made him feel profoundly sad. What if I went back to sleep for a while and forgot all this nonsense? He thought. But that wasn't to be, for he was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state was unable to get into that position. No matter how hard he threw himself to his right, he would immediately roll onto his back again. He must have tried 100 times, shutting his eyes so as not to see his wriggling legs, not stopping until he began to feel in his side a slight, dull pain that he had never felt before. My God, he thought, what an exhausting job I've chosen. Always on the go, day in and day out. There are far more worries on the road than at the office. What with the constant travel, the nuisance of making your train connections, the wretched meals eaten at odd hours, and the casual acquaintances you meet only in passing, never to see again, never to become intimate friends. To hell with it all. He felt a slight itch on the surface of his belly. Slowly he shoved himself on his back closer to the bedpost so that he could lift his head more easily. He found the place where it itched. It was covered with small white spots he did not understand. He started to touch it with one of his legs, but pulled back immediately, for the contact sent a cold shiver through him. He slid back down to his former position. Getting up this early, he thought, would turn anyone into an idiot. A man needs his sleep. Other salesmen live like harem women. For example, when I get back to the hotel in the morning to write up the sales I've made, these gentlemen are sitting down to breakfast. If I tried that with my director, I'd be fired on the spot. Actually, that might not be such a bad idea. If I didn't have to curb my tongue because of my parents, I'd given notice long ago. I'd have gone up to the director and told him from the bottom of my heart exactly what I thought. That would have knocked him from his desk. It's an odd way to run things, this sitting high at a desk and talking down to employees, especially when, since the director's hard of hearing, they have to approach so near. Well, there's hope yet. As soon as I've saved enough money to pay back what my parents owe him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll go do it for sure. Then I'll cut myself completely free. Right now, though, I'd better get up, as my train leaves at 5. He looked at the alarm clock ticking on top of the chest of drawers. God almighty, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were quietly moving forward. It was later than 6:30. It was nearly 6:45. Hadn't the alarm gone off? You could see from the bed that it had been correctly set for 4 o'clock. Of course it must have gone off. Yes, but could he really have slept peacefully through that ear-splitting racket? Well, if he hadn't slept peacefully, he slept deeply all the same. But what was he to do now? The next train left at 7. To make it, he would have to rush like mad, and his samples weren't even packed. And he himself wasn't feeling particularly spry or alert. And even if he were to make the train, there would be no avoiding a scene with the director. The office manager would have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train and would have long since reported his not showing up. The messenger, dim-witted and lacking a will of his own, was a tool of the director. Well, what if he were to call in sick? But that would look embarrassing and suspicious, since in his 5 years with the firm, Gregor had not been sick once. The director himself was sure to come over with the health insurance doctor, would upbraid his parents for their son's laziness, and would cut short all excuses by deferring to the doctor, who believed that everyone in the world was a perfectly healthy layabout. And really, would he be so wrong in this case? Apart from a drowsiness that was hard to account for after such a long sleep, Gregory really felt quite well, and in fact was exceptionally hungry. As he was thinking all of this at top speed without being able to make up his mind to get out of bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15. A cautious tap sounded on the door behind his head. "Gregor?" said a voice. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Don't you have a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor was shocked when he heard his own voice answering hers. Unmistakably his own voice, true, but mixed in with it, like an undertone, a miserable squeaking that allowed the words to be clearly heard only for a moment before rising up, reverberating to drown out their meaning, so that no one could be sure if he had heard them correctly. Gregor wanted to answer fully and give a complete explanation, but under the circumstances, he merely said, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm just getting up." Through the wooden door between them, the change in Gregor's voice was probably not obvious, for his mother, quietly accepting his words, shuffled away. However, this brief exchange had made the rest of the family aware that Gregor, surprisingly, was still in the house, and already at one of the side doors his father was knocking, softly, yet with his fist. Gregor, he called. "What's the matter?" Before long, he called once more in a deeper voice. Gregor! From the other side door came the sound of his sister's voice, gentle and plaintive. "Gregor, aren't you feeling well? Is there anything I can get you?" Gregor answered the two of them at the same time. "I'm almost ready." He tried hard to keep his voice from sounding strange by enunciating the words with great care, and by inserting long pauses between the words. His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, please open the door." But Gregor had no intention of opening the door, and was thankful for having formed, while traveling, the prudent habit of keeping all his doors locked at night, even at home. What he wanted to do now was to get up quietly and calmly, to get dressed, and above all, to eat his breakfast. Only then would he think about what to do next, for he understood that mulling things over in bed would lead him nowhere. He remembered how often in the past he had felt some small pain in bed, perhaps caused by lying in an uncomfortable position, which as soon as he had gotten up had proven to be purely imaginary, and he looked forward to seeing how this morning's fancies would gradually fade and disappear. As for the change in his voice, he hadn't the slightest doubt that it was nothing more than the first sign of a severe cold, an occupational hazard of traveling salesmen. Throwing off the blanket was easy enough. He had only to puff himself up a little, and it slipped right off. But the next part was difficult, especially as he was so unusually wide. He would have needed arms and legs to lift himself up. Instead, he had only these numerous little legs that never stopped moving and over which he had no control at all. As soon as he tried to bend one of them, it would straighten itself out. And if he finally succeeded in making it do as he wished, all the others, as if set free, would waggle about in a high degree of painful agitation. "But what's the point of lying uselessly in bed?" Gregor said to himself. He thought he might start by easing the lower part of his body out of bed first. But this lower part, which incidentally he hadn't seen yet, and of which he couldn't form a clear picture, turned out to be very difficult to budge. It went so slowly. When finally, almost in a frenzy, he gathered his strength and pushed forward desperately, he miscalculated his direction and bumped sharply against the post at the foot of the bed. and the searing pain he felt told him that, for right now at least, it was exactly this lower part of the body that was perhaps the most tender. So he tried getting the top part of the body out first, and cautiously turned his head towards the side of the bed. This proved easy enough, and eventually, despite its breadth and weight, the bulk of his body followed slowly the turning of his head. But when he finally got his head out over the edge of the bed, he felt too afraid to go any farther. For if he were to let himself fall from this position, only a miracle would prevent him from hurting his head. And it was precisely now, at all costs, that he must not lose consciousness. He would be better off staying in bed. But when after repeating his efforts, he lay sighing in his former position, and once more watched his little legs struggling with one another more furiously than ever, if that were possible, and saw no way of bringing calm and order into the mindless confusion, he again told himself that it was impossible to stay in bed, and that the wisest course would be to stake everything on the hope, however slight, of getting away from the bed. At the same time, he didn't forget to remind himself that the calmest of calm reflection was much better than frantic resolutions. During this time, he kept his eyes fixed as firmly as possible on the window. But unfortunately, the morning fog, which shrouded even the other side of the narrow street, gave him little comfort and cheer. "Already 7 o'clock, he said to himself when the alarm clock chimed again. Already 7, it's still such a thick fog. And for some time he lay still, breathing quietly, as if in the hope that utter stillness would bring all the things back to how they really and normally were. But then he said to himself, I must make sure that I'm out of bed before it strikes 7:15. Anyway, by then someone from work will have come to check on me, since the office opens before 7. And he immediately set the whole length of his body rocking with a rhythmic motion in order to swing out of bed. If he tumbled out this way, he could prevent his head from being injured by keeping it tilted upward as he fell. His back seemed to be hard. The fall on the carpet would probably not hurt it. His greatest worry was the thought of the loud crash he was bound to make. It would probably cause anxiety, if not outright fear, on the other side of the doors. Yet he had to take the chance. When Gregor was already half out of bed, his new technique made it more of a game than a struggle, since all he had to do was to edge himself across by rocking back and forth. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get someone to help him. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the maid, would be more than enough. All they would have to do would be to slip their arms under his curved back, lift him out of bed, bend down with the burden, and then wait patiently while he flipped himself right side up onto the floor, where, one might hope, his little legs would acquire some purpose. Well then, aside from the fact that the doors were locked, wouldn't it be a good idea to call for help? In spite of his misery, he could not help smiling at the thought. He had reached a point where if he rocked any harder, he was in danger of losing his balance, and very soon he would have to commit himself, because in 5 minutes it would be 7:15 when the doorbell rang. It's someone from the office, he said to himself, and almost froze while his little legs danced even faster. For a moment, everything remained quiet. They won't open the door, Gregor said to himself, clutching at an absurd sort of hope. But then, of course, the maid, as usual, went with her firm tread to the door and opened it. Gregor had only to hear the visitor's first word of greeting to know at once who it was. The office manager himself. Why was Gregor condemned to work for a firm where the most insignificant failure to appear instantly provoked the deepest suspicion? Were the employees, one and all, nothing but scoundrels? Wasn't there among them one man who was true and loyal, who if one morning he were to waste an hour or so of the firm's time, would become so conscience-stricken as to be driven out of his mind and actually rendered incapable of leaving his bed? Wouldn't it have been enough to send an office boy to ask? That is, if such prying were necessary at all, did the office manager have to come in person and thus demonstrate to an entire family of innocent people that he was the only one wise enough to properly investigate this suspicious affair? It was more from the anxiety caused by these thoughts than by any act of will that Gregor swung himself out of the bed with all his might. There was a loud thump, but not really a crash. The carpet broke his fall somewhat, and his back, too, was more elastic than he had thought, so there was only a muffled thud that was relatively unobtrusive. However, he had not lifted his head carefully enough and had banged it. He twisted it and rubbed it against the carpet in frustration and pain. "Something fell down in there," said the office manager in the room on the left. Gregor tried to imagine whether something like what had happened to him today might one day happen to the office manager. Really, one had to admit that it was possible. But as having a blunt reply to this question, the office manager took several determined steps into the next room, and his patent leather boots squeaked. From the room on the right, his sister was whispering to let him know what was going on. "Gregor, the office manager is here." "I know," said Gregor to himself, but he didn't dare speak loudly enough for his sister to hear him. "Gregor," his father now said from the room on the left, "the office manager is here and he wants to know why you weren't on the early train. We don't know what to tell him. Besides, he wants to speak to you in person, so please open the door. I'm sure he'll be kind enough to excuse any untidiness in your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the manager was calling out amiably. "He isn't feeling well," said his mother to the manager, while his father was still speaking at the door. "He's not well, sir, believe me. Why else would Gregor miss his train? The boy thinks of nothing but his work. It nearly drives me to distraction the way he never goes out in the evening. He's been here the last 8 days, and every single evening he stayed at home. He just sits here at the table with us, quietly reading the newspapers or looking over train schedules. The only enjoyment he gets is when he's working with his fret saw. For example, he spent 2 or 3 evenings cutting out a little picture frame. You'd be surprised at how pretty it is. It's hanging in his room. You'll see it in a minute, as soon as Gregor opens the door. By the way, I'm glad you've come, sir. We would have never have gotten him to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn. I'm sure he's sick, even though he wouldn't admit this morning." "I'm coming right now," said Gregor, slowly and carefully, and not moving an inch for fear of missing a single word of the conversation. "I can't imagine any other explanation, madame," said the office manager. "I hope it's nothing serious, but on the other hand, businessmen such as ourselves, fortunately or unfortunately, very often have to ignore any minor indisposition, since the demands of business comes first." "So can the office manager come in now?" asked Gregor's father impatiently, once more knocking on the door. "No," said Gregor. In the room on the left, there was an embarrassed silence. In the room on the right, his sister began to sob. But why didn't his sister go and join the others? Probably because she had just gotten out of bed and hadn't even begun to dress yet. Then why was she crying? Because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the director would start once again dunning his parents for the money they owed him? Yet surely these matters one didn't need to worry about just now. Gregor was still here and hadn't the slightest intention of deserting the family. True, at the moment he was lying on the carpet, and no one aware of his condition could seriously expect him to let the office manager in. But his minor discourtesy, for which in good time an appropriate excuse could easily be found, was unlikely to result in Gregor's being fired on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor far more sensible for them now to leave him in peace than to bother him with their tears and entreaties. But the uncertainty that preyed upon them excused their behavior. "Mr. Samsa," the office manager now called in a louder voice, "what's the matter with you? You've barricaded yourself in your room, giving only yes or no answers, causing your parents a great deal of needless grief and neglecting. I mention this only in passing, neglecting your business responsibilities to an unbelievable degree. I am speaking now in the name of your parents and of your director, and I beg you in all seriousness to give me a complete explanation at once. I'm amazed at you, simply amazed. I took you for a calm and reliable person, and now all at once you seem determined to make a ridiculous spectacle of yourself. Earlier this morning, the director did suggest to me a possible explanation for your disappearance. I'm referring to the sums of cash that were recently entrusted to you. But I particularly swore on my solemn word of honor that this could not be. However, now when I see how incredibly stubborn you are, I no longer have the slightest desire to defend you. And your position with the firm is by no means secure. I came intending to tell you all this in private, but since you're so pointlessly wasting my time, I don't see why your parents shouldn't hear it as well. For some time now, your work has left much to be desired. We are aware, of course, that this is not the prime season for doing business, but a season for doing no business at all? That, Mr. Samsa, does not and must not exist. But, sir, Gregor called out distractedly, forgetting everything else in his excitement, I'm on the verge of opening the door right now. A slight indisposition, a dizzy spell, has prevented me from getting up. I'm still in bed, but I'm feeling better already. I'm getting up now. Please be patient for just a moment. It seems I'm not quite as well as I thought. But really, I'm all right. Something like this can come on so suddenly. Only last night I was feeling fine, as my parents can tell you, or actually, I did have a slight premonition. I must have seen some sign of it. Oh, why didn't I report it to the office? But one always thinks one can get better without having to stay at home. Please, sir, have mercy on my parents. None of what you've just accused me of has any basis in fact. No one has even spoken a word to me about it. Perhaps you haven't seen the latest orders I've sent in. Anyway, I can still make the 8 o'clock train. Don't let me keep you, sir. I'll be showing up at the office very soon. Please be kind enough to inform them and convey my best wishes to the director. And while hurriedly blurting all this out, hardly knowing what he was saying, Gregor had reached the chest of drawers easily enough, perhaps because of the practice he had already gotten in bed, and was now trying to use it to lift himself upright. For he actually wanted to open the door, actually intended to show himself, and to talk with the manager. He was eager to find out what the others, who now wanted to see him so much, would say at the sight of him. If they recoiled in horror, then he would take no further responsibility and could remain peaceably where he was. But if they took it all in stride, then he too had no reason to be upset, and if he hurried, could even get to the station by 8. The first few times he slipped on the polished surface of the chest, but finally with one last heave he stood upright. He no longer paid attention to the burning pains in his abdomen, no matter how they hurt. Then, allowing himself to fall against the backrest of a nearby chair, he clung to its edges with his little legs. Now he was once more in control of himself. He fell silent and was able to hear what the manager was saying. Did you understand a single word? The office manager was asking his parents. He's not trying to make fools of us, is he? My God, cried his mother, already in tears. Maybe he's seriously ill and we're tormenting him. Great! She shouted then. Mother? Called his sister from the other side. They were calling to each other across Gregor's room. You must go to the doctor at once. Gregor is sick. Go get the doctor now. Did you hear how Gregor was speaking? That was the voice of an animal, said the manager in a tone that was noticeably restrained compared to his mother's shrillness. Anna, his father shouted through the hall to the kitchen, clapping his hands. Get a locksmith and hurry. And the two girls, their skirts rustling, were already running down the hall. How could his sister have gotten dressed so quickly? And were pulling the front door open. There was no sound of it being shut. Evidently, they had it standing open, as is the custom in houses stricken by some great sorrow. But Gregor now felt much calmer. Though the words he spoke were apparently no longer understandable, they seemed clear enough to him, even clearer than before, perhaps because his hearing had grown accustomed to their sound. In any case, people were now convinced that something was wrong with him and were ready to help him. The confidence and assurance with which these first measures had been taken comforted him. He felt himself being drawn back into the human circle and hoped for marvelous and astonishing results from both director and locksmith, without really drawing a distinction between them. To ready his voice for the crucial discussion that was now almost upon him, to make it sound as clear as possible, he coughed slightly, as quietly as he could, since for all he knew it might sound different from human coughing. Meanwhile, in the next room there was utter silence. Perhaps his parents and the manager were sitting at the table whispering. Perhaps they were, all of them, leaning against the door, listening. Gregor slowly advanced on the door, pushing the chair in front of him. Then he let go of it, grabbed onto the door for support. The pads at the end of his little legs were somewhat sticky, and leaning against it rested for a moment after his efforts. Then he started to turn the key in the lock with his mouth. Unfortunately, he didn't really have any teeth. How was he going to grip the key? But to make up for that, he clearly had very powerful jaws. With their help, he was in fact able to start turning the key, paying no attention to the fact that he was surely hurting them somehow, for a brown liquid poured out of his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor. "Listen," said the manager on the other side of the door. "He's turning the key." This was a great encouragement to Gregor, but they should have all been cheering him on. His mother and his father, too. "Come on, Gregor," they should have been shouting. Keep at it. Hold on to that key." And imagining that they were all intently following his efforts, he grimly clamped his jaws on the key with all his might. As the key continued to turn, he danced around the lock, holding himself by his mouth alone, either hanging on to the key or pressing down on it with the full weight of his body, as the situation required. The sharper sound of the lock as it finally snapped free woke Gregor up completely. With a sigh of relief, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith after all." And he pressed his head down on the handle to open one wing of the double door. Because he had to pull the wing in towards him, even when it stood wide open, he remained hidden from view. He had to edge slowly around this wing and do it very carefully, or he would fall flat on his back as he made his entrance. He was still busy carrying out this maneuver, with no time to notice anything else, when he heard the manager give a loud "Oh!" It sounded like a gust of wind, and now he could see him standing closest to the door, his hand over his open mouth, slowly backing away as if propelled by the relentless pressure of some invisible force. His mother, in spite of the manager's presence, she was standing there with her hair still unpinned and sticking out in all directions. First folded her hands and looked at Gregor's father, then took 2 steps forward and sank to the floor, her skirts billowing out all around her and her face completely buried in his breast. His father, glowering, clenched his fists as if he intended to drive Gregor back into his room. Then he looked around the living room with uncertainty, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept so hard that his great chest shook. Now, Gregor made no attempt to enter the living room, but leaned against the locked wing of the double door, so that only half of his body was visible, with his head above it, cocked to one side, peering at the others. Meanwhile, the daylight had grown much brighter. Across the street, one could clearly see a section of the endless dark gray building opposite. It was a hospital, with a row of uniform windows starkly punctuating its facade. The rain was still falling, but only in large, visibly separate drops that looked as though they were being flung one by one onto the earth. On the table, the breakfast dishes were set out in lavish profusion, for breakfast was the most important meal of the day for Gregor's father, who lingered over it for hours while reading various newspapers. Hanging onto the opposite wall was a photograph of Gregor from his army days, showing him as a lieutenant with his hand on his sword and his carefree smile demanding respect for his bearing and his rank. The door to the hall stood open, and as the front door was open too, one could see the landing beyond and the top of the stairs going down. "Well," said Gregor, who was perfectly aware that he was the only one who had kept his composure, "I'll go now and get dressed, pack up my samples, and be on my way. You will let me go, won't you? You can see, sir, that I'm not stubborn, and I'm willing to work. The life of a traveling salesman is hard, but I couldn't live without it." "Where are you going, sir?" To the office? You are? Will you give an honest report about all this? A man may be temporarily unable to work, but that's just the time to remember the service he has rendered in the past, and to bear in mind that later on, when the present problem has been resolved, he is sure to work with even more energy and diligence than before. As you know very well, I am deeply obligated to the director. At the same time, I'm responsible for my parents and my sister. I'm in a tight spot right now, but I'll get out of it. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Stand up for me at the office. People don't like traveling salesmen, I know. They think they make scads of money and lead lives of luxury, and there's no compelling reason for them to revise this prejudice. But you, sir, have a better understanding of things than the rest of the staff. A better understanding, if I may say so, than even the director himself, who, since he is the owner, can be easily swayed against an employee. You also know very well that a traveling salesman who is away from the office for most of the year can so easily fall victim to gossip and bad luck and groundless accusations against which he is powerless to defend himself, since he knows nothing about them until returning home exhausted from his journeys. He suffers personally from evil consequences that he can no longer be traced back to their origins. Sir, please don't go away without giving me some word to show that you think that I'm at least partly right. But the office manager had turned away at Gregor's first words and was looking at him now over one twitching shoulder, his mouth agape. And during Gregor's speech, he didn't stand still for even a moment, but without once taking his eyes off him, kept edging towards the door, yet very slowly, as if there were some secret injunction against his leaving the room. He was already in the hall, and from the suddenness with which he took his last step out of the living room, one might have thought that he had burned the sole of his foot. But once in the hall, he stretched out his right hand as far as possible in the direction of the staircase, as if some supernatural rescuer awaited him there. Gregor realized that he could not let the manager leave in this frame of mind, or his position with the firm would be in extreme jeopardy. His parents were incapable of clearly grasping this. Over the years, they had come to believe that Gregor was set for life with this firm, and besides, they were now so preoccupied with their immediate problems that they had lost the ability to foresee events. But Gregor had this ability. The manager must be overtaken, calmed, swayed, and finally convinced the future of Gregor and of his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was perceptive. She had already begun to cry while Gregor was still lying calmly on his back. And surely the manager, that ladies' man, would have listened to her. She would have shut the door behind them, and the hall talked him out of his fright. But his sister wasn't there, and he would have to handle this himself. And forgetting that he had no idea what his powers of movement were, and forgetting as well that once again his words would possibly, even probably, be misunderstood, he let go of the door, pushed his way through the opening, and started towards the manager, who by now was on the landing, clinging in a ridiculous manner to the banister with both hands. But as Gregor reached out for support, he immediately fell down with a little cry onto his numerous legs. The moment this happened, he felt, for the first time that morning, a sense of physical well-being. His little legs had solid ground under them, and he noticed with joy they were at his command, and were even eager to carry him in whatever direction he might desire, and he already felt sure that the final recovery from all his misery was at hand. But at that very moment, as he lay on the floor, rocking with suppressed motion, not far from his mother and just opposite her, she, who had seemed so completely overwhelmed, leapt to her feet, stretched her arms out wide, spread her fingers, and cried, "Help! For God's sake, help!" She then craned her neck forward as if to see Gregor better, but at the same time inconsistently backed away from him. Forgetting that the table with all its dishes was behind her, she sat down on it, as if in a daze when she bumped into it, seeming utterly unaware that the large coffee pot next to her had tipped over and was pouring out a flood of coffee onto the carpet. Mother, said Gregor gently, looking up at her. For the moment, he had completely forgotten the office manager. On the other hand, he couldn't resist snapping his jaws a few times at the sight of the streaming coffee. This made his mother scream again. She ran from the table and into the outstretched arms of his father, who had come rushing to her. But Gregor had no time now for his parents. The manager had already reached the staircase. With his chin on the banister railing, he was looking back for the last time. Gregor darted forward, and to be as sure as possible of catching up with him, the manager must have guessed his intention, for he sprinted down several steps and disappeared. He was still yelling, "Whoa!" and the sound echoed throughout the stairwell. Unfortunately, the manager's escape seemed to make his father, who until now had seemed reasonably calm, lose all sense of proportion. Instead of running after the man himself, or at least not interfering with Gregor's pursuit, he grabbed with his right hand the manager's cane, which he had left behind, together with his hat and overcoat on the chair. With his left hand, he snatched up a large newspaper from the table. He began stamping his feet and waving the cane and newspaper in order to drive Gregor back into his room. Nothing Gregor said made any difference. Indeed, nothing he said was even understood. No matter how humbly he lowered his head, his father only stamped the louder. Behind his father, his mother, despite the cold, had flung open a window and was leaning far outside it, her face in her hands. A strong breeze from the street blew across the room to the stairwell. The window curtains billowed inwards. The newspapers fluttered on the table. Stray pages skittered across the floor. His father, hissing like a savage, mercilessly drove him back. But as Gregor had no practice in walking backwards, it was a very slow process. If he had been given a chance to turn around, then he would have gotten back into his room at once. But he was afraid that the length of time it would take him to turn around would exasperate his father, and that at any moment the cane in his father's hand might deal him a fatal blow on his back or his head. In the end, though, he had no choice, for he noticed to his horror that while moving backwards, he couldn't even keep a straight course. And so, looking back anxiously, he began turning around as quickly as possible, which in reality was very slowly. Perhaps his father divined his good intentions, for he did not interfere, and even helped to direct the maneuver from afar with the tip of his cane. If only he would stop that unbearable hissing. It made Gregor completely lose his concentration. He had turned himself almost all the way around when, confused by this hissing, he made a mistake and started turning back the wrong way. But when at last he had succeeded in getting his head in front of the doorway, he found that his body was too wide to make it through. Of course, his father, in the state he was in, couldn't even begin to consider opening the other wing of the door to let Gregor in. His mind was on one thing only, to drive Gregor back into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have permitted the complicated preparations necessary for Gregor to haul himself upright and in that way perhaps slip through. Instead, making even more noise, he urged Gregor forward as if the way were clear. To Gregor, the noise behind him no longer sounded like the voice of merely one father. This really wasn't a joke. And Gregor squeezed himself into the doorway, heedless of the consequences. One side of his body lifted up. He was pitched at an angle in the doorway. The other side was scraped raw. Ugly blotches stained the white door. Soon he was stuck fast and couldn't have moved any further by himself. On one side, his little legs hung trembling in the air, while those on the other side were painfully crushed against the door, when from behind his father gave him a hard blow that was truly a deliverance, and bleeding profusely, he flew far into his room. Behind him, the door was slammed shut with the cane, and then at last everything was still. 2. It was already dusk when Gregor awoke from a deep, almost comatose sleep. Surely, even if he hadn't been disturbed, he would have soon awakened by himself, since he'd rested and slept long enough. Yet it seemed to him that he'd been awakened by the sound of hurried steps and the furtive closing of the hallway door. The light from the electric street lamps cast pale streaks here and there on the ceiling and the upper part of the furniture. But down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. Groping awkwardly with the feelers, which he was only now beginning to appreciate, he slowly pushed himself over to the door to see what had been going on there. His left side felt as if it were one long, painfully tightening scar, and he was actually limping on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been badly hurt during the morning's events. It was nearly miraculous that only one had been hurt, and it trailed along lifelessly. Only when he had reached the door did he realize what had impelled him forward, the smell of something to eat. For there stood a bowl full of fresh milk, in which floated small slices of white bread. He could have almost laughed for joy, since he was even hungrier now than he had been during the morning, and he immediately dipped his head into the milk, almost up to his eyes. But he soon drew it back in disappointment. Not only did he find it difficult to eat because of the soreness of his left side, but he was capable of eating only if his whole gasping body cooperated. But also because he didn't like the milk at all. Although it had once been his favorite drink, which no doubt was why his sister had brought it in. In fact, he turned away from the bowl almost in disgust and crawled back to the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor could see through the crack in the door, the gaslight had been lit. But while this was the hour when his father would usually be reading the afternoon paper in a loud voice to his mother, and sometimes to his sister as well, now there wasn't a sound to be heard. Well, perhaps this custom of reading aloud, which his sister was always telling him about or mentioning in her letters, had recently been discontinued. Still, though the apartment was completely silent, it was scarcely deserted. "What a quiet life the family's been leading," said Gregor to himself, and staring fixedly into the darkness, he felt a genuine pride at having been able to provide his parents and his sister with such a life in such a nice apartment. But what if all this calm prosperity and contentment were to end in horror? So as not to give in to such thoughts, Gregor set himself in motion, and he crawled up and down the room. Once during the long evening, first one of the side doors and then the other was opened a crack and then quickly shut. Someone, it seemed, had wanted to come in, but then had thought better of it. Gregor now stationed himself so as to somehow get the hesitant visitor to come in, or at least to find out who it might be. But the door did not open again, and he waited in vain. That morning, when the doors had been locked, everyone had wanted to come in. But now, after he had locked one of the doors himself, and the others had evidently been unlocked during the day, nobody came in, and the keys, too, were now on the outside. It was late at night before the light was put out in the living room, and it was easy for Gregor to tell that his parents and sister had stayed up all the while, since he could plainly hear the three of them as they tiptoed away. As it was obvious that no one would be visiting Gregor before morning, he had plenty of time in which to contemplate undisturbed how best to rearrange his life. But the open, high-ceilinged room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor filled him with a dread which he couldn't account for, since it was, after all, the room he had lived in for the past 5 years. Almost unthinkingly, and not without a faint sense of shame, he scurried under the couch. There, although his back was slightly cramped and he could no longer raise his head, he immediately felt very much at home, and his only regret was that his body was too wide to fit completely under the couch. There he spent the rest of the night, now in a doze from which hunger pains kept wakening him with a start. Now preoccupied with worries and vague hopes, all of which, however, led to the same conclusion, that for the time being he must remain calm, and by being patient and showing every consideration, try to help his family bear the burdens that his present condition had placed upon them. Early the next morning, the night was barely over, Gregor got an opportunity to test the strength of his newly made resolutions, because his sister, who was almost fully dressed, opened the hallway door and looked in expectantly. She didn't see him at first, but when she spotted him underneath the couch, well, my God, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't just fly away. She was so surprised that she lost her self-control and slammed the door shut again. But as if she felt sorry for her behavior, she opened it again right away and tiptoed in, as if she were in the presence of someone who was very ill, or who was a stranger. Gregor had moved his head forward almost to the edge of the couch and was watching her. Would she notice that he'd let the milk sit there? And not from lack of hunger, but would she bring him some other food that was more to his taste? If she wasn't going to be able to do it on her own, he'd sooner starve than call her attention to it. Although, in fact, he was feeling a tremendous urge to dash out from under the couch, fling himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. But his sister immediately noticed to her astonishment that the bowl was still full, with only a little milk spilt around it. She picked up the bowl at once, not, it's true, with her bare hands, but using a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious to find out what she would bring in its place, and he speculated at length as to what it might be. But he never would have guessed what his sister, in the goodness of her heart, actually did. She brought him a wide range of choices, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones left over from dinner, covered with a congealed white sauce, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese which Gregor 2 days ago had declared inedible, a slice of plain bread, a slice of bread and butter, and a slice with butter and salt. In addition to all this, she replaced the bowl, now evidently reserved for Gregor, filled this time with water. And out of a sense of delicacy, since she knew that Gregor wouldn't eat in front of her, she left in a hurry, even turning the key in the lock in order that Gregor might know that he was free to make himself as comfortable as possible. Gregor's legs whirred as they propelled him forward to the food. Besides, his wounds must have healed completely, for he no longer felt handicapped, which amazed him. He thought of how a month ago he cut his finger slightly with his knife, and how only the day before yesterday that little wound had still hurt. Am I less sensitive now? He wondered, greedily sucking on the cheese, to which, above all the other dishes, he was immediately and strongly attracted. Tears of joy welled up in his eyes as he devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, were not to his liking. In fact, he couldn't stand to smell, and he actually dragged the food he wanted to eat a little way off. He'd long since finished eating, and was merely lying lazily in the same spot when his sister began to slowly turn the key in the lock as a signal for him to withdraw. He got up at once, although he had almost fallen asleep, and scurried back under the couch. But it took a great deal of self-control for him to remain under the couch, even for the brief time his sister was in the room. For his heavy meal had swollen his body to some extent, and he could scarcely breathe in that confined space. Between little fits of suffocation, he stared with slightly bulging eyes as his unsuspecting sister took a broom and swept away not only the scraps of what he'd eaten, but also the food that he'd left untouched, as if these too were no longer any good, and hurriedly dumped everything into a bucket, which she covered with a wooden lid and carried away. She hardly turned her back before Gregor came out from under the couch to stretch and puff himself out. So this was how Gregor was fed each day, once in the morning when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and again after the family's midday meal, while his parents took another brief nap and his sister could send the maid away on some errand or other. His parents didn't want Gregor to starve any more than his sister did, but perhaps for them to be directly involved in his feeding was more than they could bear, or perhaps his sister wanted to shield them even from what might prove to be no more than a minor discomfort, for they were surely suffering enough as it was. Gregor was unable to discover what excuses had served to get rid of the doctor and the locksmith that first morning. Since the others couldn't understand what he had said, it never occurred to them, not even to his sister, that he could understand them. So when his sister was in the room, he had to be satisfied with occasionally hearing her sighs and her appeals to the saints. Only later, after she began to get used to the situation, of course, she could never become completely used to it, would Gregor sometimes hear a remark that was intended to be friendly, or could be so interpreted. He really liked it today, she'd say when Gregor had polished off a good portion, and when the opposite was the case, which began to happen more and more often, she'd say almost sadly, once again, he didn't touch a thing. But while Gregor wasn't able to get any news directly, he could overhear a considerable amount from the adjoining rooms. As soon as he would hear the sound of voices, he would immediately run to the appropriate door and press his whole body against it. In the early days especially, there wasn't a conversation that didn't in some way, if only indirectly, refer to him. For 2 whole days, at every meal, the family discussed what they should do, and they kept on doing so between meals as well. For at least 2 members of the family were now always at home, probably because nobody wanted to be in the apartment alone, and it would be unthinkable to leave it empty. Furthermore, on the very first day, the cook, it wasn't completely clear how much she knew of what had happened, had on her knees begged Gregor's mom to dismiss her immediately. And when she said her goodbyes a quarter of an hour later, she thanked them for her dismissal with tears in her eyes, as if this had been the greatest favor ever bestowed on her in the house. And without having to be asked, she made a solemn vow never to breathe a word of this to anyone. So now his sister, together with his mother, had to do all the cooking as well. Though in fact this wasn't too much of a chore, since the family ate practically nothing. Gregor kept hearing them vainly urging one another to eat, without receiving any reply except, "No thanks, I've had enough," or some similar remark. They didn't seem to drink anything either. His sister would often ask his father if he'd like some beer, and would gladly offer to go out and get it herself. When he wouldn't respond, she'd say, in order to remove any hesitation on his part, that she could always send the janitor's wife, but at that point, the father would finally utter an emphatic no. And that would be the end of the matter. It was on the very first day that his father gave a full account to both mother and sister of the family's financial situation and prospects. Every now and then he would get up from the table and take a receipt or notebook from out of the small safe he'd salvaged from the collapse of his business 5 years before. He could be heard opening the complicated lock and then securing it again after taking out whatever he'd been looking for. The account that his father gave, or at least part of it, was the first encouraging news that Gregor had heard since being imprisoned. He'd always had the impression that his father had failed to save a penny from the ruin of his business. At least his father had never told him otherwise, and Gregor, for that matter, had never asked him about it. At that time, Gregor's only concern had been to do his utmost to make the family forget as quickly as possible the business failure that had plunged them all into a state of total despair. And so he had set out to work with tremendous zeal and had risen almost overnight from junior clerk to becoming a traveling salesman, which naturally opened up completely new financial opportunities, so that in no time at all his success was instantly translated by way of commissions into hard cash, which could be laid out on the table under the eyes of his astonished and delighted family. Those had been wonderful times, and they had never returned, at least not with the same glory, even though later on Gregor had been earning enough to pay the entire family expenses, and in fact had been doing so. They had simply gotten used to it, both family and Gregor. They had gratefully accepted the money, and he had given it gladly, but no special warmth went with it. Gregor had remained close only to his sister, and it was his secret plan that she, who unlike Gregor loved music and could play the violin with deep feeling, should next year attend the conservatory, despite the expense which, great as it was, would have to be met in some way. During Gregor's brief stays in the city, and the subject of the conservatory would often come up in his conversations with his sister, but always only as a beautiful dream that wasn't meant to come true. His parents weren't happy to hear even these innocent remarks, but Gregor's ideas on the subject were firm, and he had intended to make a solemn announcement on Christmas Eve. Such were the thoughts, so futile in his present condition, that ran through his mind as he stood there, pressed against the door, listening. Sometimes he would grow so thoroughly weary that he couldn't listen any more and would carelessly let his head bump against the door. And though he'd pulled it back immediately, even the slight noise he'd made would be heard in the next room, causing everyone to fall silent. "What's he up to now?" his father would say after a pause, obviously looking at the door, and only then would be interrupted, conversation gradually be resumed. Gregor now learned with considerable thoroughness, for his father tended to repeat his explanations several times, partly because he hadn't dealt with these matters in a long time, and partly because his mother didn't understand everything the first time through. That despite their catastrophic ruin, a certain amount of capital, a very small amount, it's true, had survived intact from the old days, and thanks to the interest being untouched, had even increased slightly. And what was more, the money which Gregor had been bringing home every month, he'd kept only a small sum for himself, hadn't been completely spent, and had grown into a tidy sum. Gregor nodded eagerly behind the door, delighted to hear of this unexpected foresight and thrift. Of course he might have been able to use this extra money to pay off more of his father's debt to the director, and thus have brought nearer the day when he could quit his current job, but given the present circumstances, things were better the way his father had arranged them. Now, the sum of this money wasn't nearly large enough for the family to live off the interest. The principal might support them for a year or two at the most, but that was all. So this was really only a sum that was not to be touched, but saved instead for emergencies. As for money to live on, that would have to be earned. Though Gregor's father was indeed still healthy, nevertheless he was an old man who hadn't worked for 5 years, and one from whom not too much should be expected in any case. During those 5 years, the first ones of leisure in his hard-working but unsuccessful life, he had put on a lot of weight and consequently had grown somewhat sluggish. And as for Gregor's elderly mother, was she supposed to start bringing in money, burdened as she was by her asthma, which made it strain for her to even walk across the apartment, and which kept her gasping for breath every other day on the couch by the open window? Or should his sister go to work instead? She, though 17, was still a child, and one, moreover, whom it would be cruel to deprive of the life she'd led up until now. A life of wearing pretty clothes, sleeping late, helping around the house, enjoying a few modest pleasures, and above all, playing the violin. At first, whenever the conversation turned to the need of money, Gregor would let go the door and fling himself down on the cool leather couch which stood beside it, for he felt hot with grief and shame. Often he would lie there all night long, not sleeping a wink, scratching at the leather couch for hours. or undaunted by the great effort it required, he would push the chair over to the window. Then he would crawl up to the sill and, propped up by the chair, would lean against the pane, apparently inspired by some memory of the sense of freedom that gazing out of a window used to give him. For in truth, objects were only a short distance away, were now, each day, becoming more indistinct. The hospital across the street, which he used to curse because he could see it all too clearly, was now completely outside his field of vision. And if he hadn't known for a fact that he lived on Charlotte Street, a quiet but nevertheless urban street, he could have imagined that he was looking out the window at a wasteland where gray sky and gray earth had indistinguishably merged as one. His observant sister needed only to notice twice that the armchair had been moved to the window. From then on, whenever she cleaned the room, she carefully placed a chair back by the window and even began leaving the inner casement open. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him. He could have borne her kindness more easily, but as it was, they were painful to him. Of course, his sister tried her best to ease the general embarrassment, and naturally, as time passed, she grew better and better at it. But Gregor, too, over time, gained a clearer sense of what was involved. Even the way in which she entered the room was a torture to him. No sooner had she stepped in, when not even pausing to shut the door, despite the care she normally would take in sparing others the sight of Gregor's room, she would run straight over to the window, tear it open with impatient fingers, almost as if she were suffocating, and she would remain for some time by the window, even in the coldest weather, breathing deeply. Twice a day she would terrify Gregor with all this noise and rushing around. He would cower under the couch the entire time, knowing full well that she surely would have spared him this, if only she could have stood being in the room with him with the windows closed. Once, about a month after Gregor's metamorphosis, so there was really no particular reason for his sister to be upset by his appearance, she came in earlier than usual and caught Gregor as he gazed out the window, terrifying in his stillness. It wouldn't have surprised Gregor if she decided not to come in, since his position prevented her from opening the window right away. But not only did she not come in, she actually jumped back and shut the door. A stranger might have thought that Gregor had been planning to ambush her and bite her. Of course, he immediately hid on the couch, but he had to wait until noon before she came back. And this time she seemed much more nervous than usual. In this way, he came to realize that the sight of him disgusted her, and likely would always disgust her, and that she probably had to steel herself not to run away at the sight of even the tiny proportion of his body that stuck out from under the couch. So one day, to spare her even this, he carried the bedsheet on his back over to the couch. It took him 4 hours, and spread it so that he was comfortably covered, and his sister wouldn't be able to see him even if she bent down. If she felt the sheet wasn't necessary, then of course she could remove it, since obviously Gregor wasn't shutting himself away so completely in order to amuse himself. But she left the sheet alone, and Gregor even thought that he caught a look of gratitude when he cautiously lifted the sheet a little with his head in order to see how his sister was taking the new arrangement. During the first 2 weeks, his parents couldn't bring themselves to come in to see him, and he frequently heard them remarking how much they appreciated his sister's efforts. Whereas previously they'd often been annoyed with her for being, in their eyes, somewhat useless. But now both father and mother had fallen into the habit of waiting outside Gregor's door while his sister cleaned up the room, and as soon as she emerged, she would have to tell them every detail of the room's condition, what Gregor had eaten, how he'd behaved this time, and whether he'd shown a little improvement. It wasn't long before his mother began to want to visit Gregor, but his father and sister were at first able to dissuade her by rational arguments to which Gregor listened with great care, and with which he thoroughly agreed. But as time went by, she had to be restrained by force, and when she cried out, "Let me go to Gregor, he's my unhappy boy! Don't you understand I have to go to him?" Gregor began to think that it might be a good idea if his mother did come in after all. Not every day, naturally, but say once a week. She was really a much more capable person than his sister, who, for all her courage, was still only a child and had perhaps taken on such a difficult task only out of a childish impulsiveness. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor didn't want to show himself at the window, if only out of consideration for his parents. But his few square meters of floor gave him little room to crawl around in. He found it hard to lie still even at night, and eating soon ceased to give him any pleasure. So in order to distract himself, he fell into the habit of crawling all over the walls and the ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging from the ceiling. It was completely indifferent from lying on the floor. He could breathe more freely, a faint pulsing coursed through his body, and in his state of almost giddy absent-mindedness up there, Gregor would sometimes, to his surprise, lose his grip and tumble onto the floor. But now, of course, since he had much better control of his body, even such a great fall didn't hurt him. His sister noticed right away the new pastime Gregor had discovered for himself. He left sticky traces where he had been crawling. And so she got it into her head to provide Gregor with as much room as possible to crawl around in by removing all the furniture that was in the way, especially the chest of drawers and the desk. But she couldn't manage this by herself. She didn't dare ask her father for help. The maid wouldn't be any use, and for a while this girl, who was around 16, was brave enough to stay on after the cook had left. She had asked to be allowed to always keep the kitchen door locked, opening it only when specifically asked to do so. This left his sister with no choice but one day, when her father was out, to ask her mother for help. And indeed, her mother followed her with joyful, excited cries, although she fell silent when they reached the door to Gregor's room. Naturally, his sister first made sure that everything in the room was as it should be. Only then did she let her mother come in. Gregor had hurriedly pulled his sheet even lower and had folded it more tightly, and it really did look as if it had been casually tossed across the couch. This time, Gregor also refrained from peeking out from under the sheet. He denied himself the pleasure of seeing his mother from now, and was simply glad that she'd come after all. "Come on in, he's nowhere in sight," said his sister, apparently leading his mother in by the hand. Now Gregor could hear the two delicate women moving the heavy chest of drawers away from its place, his sister stubbornly insisting on doing the hardest work, ignoring the warnings of her mother, who was afraid her daughter would overstrain herself. The work took a very long time. After struggling for over a quarter of an hour, his mother suggested that they might leave the chest where it was in the first place. It was just too heavy, and they'd never be done before his father came home, and they'd have to leave it in the middle of the room, blocking Gregor's movements in every direction. In the second place, it wasn't all certain that they were doing Gregor a favor in removing the furniture. It seemed to her that the opposite was true. The sight of the bare walls broke her heart, and why shouldn't Gregor feel the same, since he'd been used to the furniture for so long and would feel abandoned in the empty room? And wouldn't it look as if, his mother concluded very softly, in fact she'd been almost whispering the whole time, as if she wanted to prevent Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she didn't know, from hearing the sound of her voice. She was convinced that he couldn't understand her words. As if by removing his furniture, we were telling him that we'd given up all hope of his getting better, and were callously leaving him to his own devices? I think the best would be to try to keep the room exactly the way it was, so that when Gregor does come back to us, he'll find everything the same, making it easier for him to forget what happened in the meantime. When he heard his mother's words, Gregor realized that over the past 2 months, the lack of having anyone to converse with, together with the monotonous life within the family, must have befuddled his mind. There wasn't any other way he could explain to himself how he could have ever seriously wanted his room cleared. Did he really want this warm room of his, so comfortably furnished with family heirlooms, transformed into a lair where he'd be perfectly free to crawl around in every direction, but only at the cost of simultaneously forgetting his human past, swiftly and utterly? Just now, he'd been on the brink of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he hadn't heard for so long, had brought him back. Nothing should be removed. Everything must stay. He couldn't do without the furniture's soothing influence on the state of mind, and if the furniture were to impede his senseless crawling about, that wouldn't be a loss, but rather a great advantage. But unfortunately, his sister thought otherwise. She'd become accustomed, and not without some justification, to assuming the role of the acknowledged expert whenever she and her parents discussed Gregor's affair. So her mother's advice was enough for her to insist now not merely on her original plan of moving the chest and the desk, but on the removal of every bit of furniture except for the indispensable couch. Her resolve, to be sure, didn't stem merely from childish stubbornness or from the self-confidence she had recently and unexpectedly gained at such great cost. For in fact, she noticed that while Gregor needed plenty of room to crawl around in, on the other hand, as far as she could tell, he never used the furniture at all. Perhaps, too, the sentimental enthusiasm of girls her age, which they indulge themselves in at every opportunity, now tempted Greet to make Gregor's situation all the more terrifying so that she might be able to do more for him. No one but Greet would ever be likely to enter a room where Gregor ruled the bare walls, all alone. And so she refused to give in to her mother, who in any case, from the sheer anxiety caused by being in Gregor's room, seemed unsure of herself. She soon fell silent and began as best as she could to help her daughter remove the chest of drawers. Well, if he must, then Gregor could do without the chest, but the desk had to stay, and no sooner had the two women, groaning and squeezing, gotten the chest out of the room than Gregor poked his head out from under the couch to see how he might intervene as tactfully as possible. But unfortunately, it was his mother who came in first, leaving Greet in the next room, gripping the chest with her arms and rocking it back and forth without, of course, being able to budge it from the spot. His mother wasn't used to the sight of him. It might make her sick. So Gregor, frightened, scuttled backwards to the far end of the couch, but he couldn't prevent the front of the sheet from stirring slightly. That was enough to catch his mother's attention. She stopped, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greet. Gregor had kept telling himself that nothing unusual was happening, that only a few pieces of furniture were being moved around. But he soon had to admit that all this coming and going of the two women, their little calls to one another, the scraping of the furniture across the floor affected him as if it were some gigantic commotion rushing in on him from every side. And though he tucked in his head and legs and pressed his body against the floor, he had to accept the fact that he wouldn't be able to stand it much longer. They were cleaning out his room, taking away from him everything that he had loved. Already they'd carried off his chest where he kept his fret saw and his other tools. Now they were trying to pry his writing desk loose. It was practically embedded in the floor, the same desk where he had always done his homework when he had been a student at business school, in high school, and even in elementary school. He really no longer had any time left in which to weigh the good intentions of these two women, whose existence, for that matter, he'd almost forgotten, since they were so exhausted by now that they worked in silence, the only sound being that of their weary, plodding steps. And so, while the women were in the next room, leaning against the desk and trying to catch their breath, he broke out, changing his direction 4 times, since he really didn't know what to rescue first. When he saw, hanging conspicuously on the otherwise bare wall, the picture of the lady all dressed in furs. He quickly crawled up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which held him fast, soothing his hot belly. Now that Gregor completely covered it, this picture at least wasn't about to be carried away by anyone. He turned his head towards the living room door so that he could watch the women when they returned. They hadn't taken much of a rest and were already coming back. Greet had put her arm around her mother and was almost carrying her. "Well, what should we take next?" said Greet, looking around, and then her eyes met Gregor's, looking down at her from the wall. Probably only because her mother was there, she kept her composure, bent her head down to her mother to prevent her from glancing around, and said, though in a hollow, quavering voice, "Come on, let's go back to the living room for a minute." To Gregor, her intentions were obvious. She wanted to get his mother to safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, just let her try. He clung to his picture and he wasn't going to give up. He'd rather fly at Greet's face. But Greet's words had made her mother even more anxious. She stepped aside, glimpsed the huge brown blotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before she fully understood that what she was looking at was Gregor, she cried out, "Oh God, oh God!" in a hoarse scream of a voice, and as if going up completely, fell with outstretched arms across the couch and lay there without moving. "You, Gregor!" cried his sister, raising her fist and glaring at him. These were the first 2 words she had addressed directly to him since his metamorphosis. She ran into the room next to get some spirits to revive her mother from her faint. Gregor also wanted to help. He could rescue the picture another time, but he was stuck to the glass and had to tear himself free. He then scuttled into the next room as if to give some advice, as he used to his sister. Instead, he had to stand behind her uselessly while she rummaged among various little bottles. When she turned around and she was startled, a bottle fell to the floor. A splinter of glass struck Gregor in the face. Some sort of corrosive medicine splashed on him, and Greet, without further delay, grabbing as many of the little bottles as she could carry, ran inside with them to her mother and slammed the door shut behind her with her foot. Now Gregor was out, cut off from his mother, who was perhaps near death because of him. He didn't dare open the door for fear of scaring his sister, who had to remain with his mother. There wasn't anything for him to do but wait, and so, tormented by guilt and anxiety, he began crawling. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, until finally, in despair, the room began spinning around him. He collapsed into the middle of the large table. A short time passed. Gregor lay there stupefied. Everything was quiet around him. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The maid, of course, stayed locked up in her kitchen, so Greet had to answer the door. His father was back. "What's happened?" were his first words. Greet's expression must have told him everything. Her answers came in muffled tones. She was obviously burying her face in her father's chest. "Mother fainted, but she's better now. Gregor's broken loose." "I knew it," her father said. "I told you this would happen, but you women refused to listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had put the worst construction on Greet's all too brief account and had assumed that Gregor was guilty of some violent act. That meant that he must calm his father down, since he had neither the time nor the ability to explain things to him. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it in order that his father might see, as soon as he entered the living room, that Gregor had every intention of returning immediately to his room, and there was no need to force him back. All they had to do was to open the door, and he would disappear at once. But his father wasn't in the mood to notice subtleties. "Ah," he roared as he entered, in a voice that sounded at once furious and gleeful. Gregor turned his head from the door and lifted toward his father's. He really hadn't imagined that his father would look the way he did standing before him now. True, Gregor had too absorbed lately by his new habit of crawling to bother about whatever else might be going on in the apartment, and he should have anticipated that there would be some changes. And yet, could this really be his father? Was this same man who used to lie sunk in bed exhausted whenever Gregor was set out on one of his business trips, who would greet him upon his return in the evening while sitting in his bathrobe in the armchair, who was hardly capable of getting to his feet, and to show his joy could only lift up his arms, and who, on those rare times when the whole family went out for a walk, on the occasional Sunday or on a legal holiday, used to painfully shuffle along between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers themselves, and yet he was always slightly slower than they, wrapped up in his old overcoat, carefully planting his crook-handled cane before him with every step, and almost invariably stopping and gathering his escort around him whenever he wanted to say something. Now, however, he held himself very erect, dressed up in a closely fitted blue uniform with gold buttons, of the kind worn by bank messengers. His heavy chin thrust out over the stiff collar of his jacket. His black eyes stared sharp and bright from under his bushy eyebrows. His white hair, once so rumpled, was combed flat. It gleamed, and the part was meticulously exact. He tossed his cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably that of some bank, in an arc across the room so that it landed on the couch, and with his hands in his pockets, the tails of his uniform's long jacket flung back, his face grim, he went after Gregor. He probably didn't know himself what he was going to do, but he lifted his feet unusually high, and Gregor was amazed at the immense size of the soles of his boots. However, Gregor didn't dwell on these reflections, for he had known from the very first day of his new life that his father considered only the strictest measures to be appropriate in dealing with him. So he ran ahead of his father, stopped when he stood still, and scurried on again when he made the slightest move. In this way, they circled the room several times without anything decisive happening. In fact, their movements, because of their slow tempo, did not suggest those of a chase. So Gregor kept to the floor for the time being, especially since he was afraid that his father might consider any flight to the walls or ceiling to be particularly offensive. All the same, Gregor had to admit that he wouldn't be able to keep up even this pace for long, since whenever his father took a single step, Gregor had to perform an entire series of movements. He was beginning to get winded, since even in his former life his lungs had never been strong. As he kept staggering on like this, so weary he could barely keep his eyes open, since he was saving all his strength for running, not even thinking, dazed as he was, that there might be any other way to escape than by running, having almost forgotten that he was free to use the walls, though against the walls, admittedly, were placed bits of intricately carved furniture bristling with spikes and sharp corners. Suddenly, something sailed overhead, hit the floor nearby, and rolled right in front of him. It was an apple. At once, a second one came flying after it. Gregor stopped, petrified with fear. It was useless to keep on running, for his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with the fruit from the bowl on the sideboard, and now he was throwing one apple after another, for now at least without bothering to take good aim. These little red apples, colliding with one another, rolled around the floor as if electrified. One weakly thrown apple grazed Gregor's back, rolling off without causing harm. But another one that came flying immediately afterwards actually embedded itself in Gregor's back. Gregor wanted to drag himself onward as if this shocking and unbelievable pain might disappear if he could only keep moving, but he felt as if he were nailed to the spot, and he splayed himself out in the utter confusion of his senses. With his last glance, he saw the door of his room burst open, and his mother, wearing only her chemise, his sister had removed her dress to help her breathe after she fainted, rush out, followed by his screaming sister. He saw his mother run towards his father, her loosened underskirts slipping one by one onto the floor. Stumbling over her skirts, she flung herself upon his father, embraced him, was as one with him, but now Gregor's sight grew dim, and with her arms clasped around his father's neck, begged for Gregor's life. 3. Gregor's serious wound, which made him suffer for over a month, the apple remained embedded in his flesh as a visible reminder, no one having the courage to remove it, seemed to have persuaded even his father that Gregor, despite his present pathetic and disgusting shape, was a member of the family who shouldn't be treated as an enemy. On the contrary, familial duty required them to swallow their disgust and to endure him and nothing more. Although his wound probably had caused Gregor to suffer a permanent loss of mobility, and though now it took him, as if he were a disabled war veteran, many a long minute to creep across the room, crawling above ground level was out of the question. Yet in return for this deterioration of his condition, he was granted a compensation which satisfied him completely. Each day around dusk, the living room door, which was in the habit of watching closely for an hour or two ahead of time, was opened. And lying in the darkness of the room, invisible from the living room, he could see the whole family sitting at the table lit by a lamp and could listen to their conversation as if by general consent, instead of the way he'd done before. True, these were no longer the lively conversations of old, those upon which Gregor had mused him somewhat wistfully as he settled wearily into his damp bed in some tiny hotel room. Things were now very quiet for the most part. Soon after his dinner, his father would fall asleep in his armchair, while his mother and sister would admonish each other to be quiet. His mother, bending forward under light, would sew fine lingerie for a fashion store. His sister, who had found work as a salesgirl, would study shorthand and French in the evenings, hoping to obtain a better job in the future. Sometimes his father would wake up, as if he hadn't the slightest idea that he'd been asleep, and would say to his mother, "Look how long you've been sewing again today," and then would fall back to sleep, while his mother and sister would exchange weary smiles. With a kind of perverse obstinacy, his father refused to take off his messenger's uniform, even in the apartment. While his robe hung unused on the clothes hook, he would sleep fully dressed in his chair, as if he were always ready for duty and were waiting even here for the voice of his superior. As a result, his uniform, which hadn't been new in the first place, began to get dirty in spite of all of his mother and sister could do to care for it. And Gregor would often spend entire evenings gazing at the garment covered with stains and with its constantly polished buttons gleaming, in which the old man would sit, upright and comfortable, yet peacefully asleep. As soon as the clock would strike 10, his mother would try to awaken his father with soft words of encouragement and then persuade him to go to bed, for this wasn't any place in which to get a decent night's sleep. And his father badly needed his rest, since he had to be at work at 6 in the morning. But with the stubbornness that had possessed him ever since he'd become a bank messenger, he would insist on staying at the table a little while longer, though he invariably would fall asleep again, and then it was only with the greatest difficulty that he could be persuaded to trade his chair for bed. No matter how much mother and sister would urge on with little admonishments, he keeps shaking his head for a good 15 minutes, his eyes closed, and wouldn't get up. Gregor's mother would tug at his sleeve, whisper sweet words into his ear, and his sister would leave her homework to help her mother, but it was all useless. He only sank deeper into his armchair. Not until the two women would lift him up by the arms would he open his eyes, look now at one, now at the other, and usually say, "What a life! So this is the peace of my old age." And leaning on the two women, he would get up laboriously, as if he were his own greatest burden, and would allow the women to lead him to the door, where, waving them aside, he continued on his own, while Gregor's mother abandoned her sewing and his sister her pen, so that they might run after his father and continue to look after him. Who in this overworked and exhausted family had time to worry about Gregor any more than was absolutely necessary? Their resources grew more limited. The maid was now dismissed after all. A gigantic bony cleaning woman with white hair fluttered about her head came in the mornings and evenings to do the roughest work. Gregor's mother took care of everything else. In addition to her sewing, it even happened that certain pieces of family jewelry, which his mother and sister had worn with such pleasure at parties and celebrations in days gone by, were sold. As Gregor found out one evening by listening to a general discussion of the prices they'd gone for. But their greatest complaint was that they couldn't give up the apartment, which was too big for their current needs, since no one could figure out how they could move Gregor. But Gregor understood clearly enough that it wasn't simply a consideration for him which prevented them moving, since he could have easily been transported in a suitable crate equipped with a few air holes. The main reason preventing them from moving was their utter despair and the feeling that they had been struck by a misfortune far greater than any that had ever visited their friends and relatives. What the world demands of the poor, they did to the utmost. His father fetched breakfast for the bank's minor officials. His mother sacrificed herself for the underwear of strangers. His sister ran back and forth behind the counters at the beck and call of customers, but they lacked the strength for anything beyond this. And the wound in Gregor's back began to ache once more when his mother and sister, after putting his father to bed, returned to the room, ignored their work, and sat huddled together cheek to cheek. And his mother said, "Close that door, Greet," so that Gregor was back in the dark, while in the next room the women wept together, or simply stared at a table with dry eyes. Gregor spent the days and nights almost entirely without sleep. Sometimes he imagined that the next time the door opened, he would once again assume control of the family's affairs, as he'd done in the old days. Now, after a long absence, there reappeared in his thought the director and the manager, the salesman and the apprentices, the remarkably stupid errand runner, 2 or 3 friends from other firms, a chambermaid at one of the provincial hotels, a sweet fleeting memory, a cashier at a hat store whom he courted earnestly but too slowly. They all came to him mixed up with strangers and with people whom he'd already forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable, and he was glad when they faded away. At other times, he was in no mood to worry about his family. He was utterly filled with rage at how badly he was being treated. And although he couldn't imagine anything that might tempt his appetite, he nevertheless tried to think up ways of getting into the pantry to take what was rightfully his, even if he wasn't hungry. No longer bothering to consider what Gregor might like as a treat, his sister, before hurried off to work in the morning and after lunch, would shove any sort of food into Gregor's room with her foot. In the evening, regardless of whether the food had been picked at or, as was more often the case, left completely untouched, she would sweep it out with a swish of the broom. Nowadays, she would clean the room in the evening, and she couldn't have done it any faster. Streaks of grime ran along the walls, balls of dust and dirt lay here and there on the floor. At first, whenever his sister would come in, Gregor would station himself in some corner that was particularly objectionable, as if his presence there might serve as a reproach to her. But he probably could have remained there for weeks without her mending her ways. She obviously could see the dirt as clearly as he could, but she'd made her mind to leave it. At the same time, she made certain, with a touchiness that was completely new to her, and which indeed was infecting the entire family, that the cleaning of Gregor's room was to remain her prerogative. On one occasion, Gregor's mother had subjected his room to a thorough cleaning, which she managed to accomplish only with the aid of several buckets of water. All this down to being a further annoyance to Gregor, who lay flat, unhappy, and motionless on the couch. But his mother's punishment was not long in coming. For that evening, as soon as Gregor's sister noticed a difference in his room, she ran, deeply insulted, into the living room. Without regard for his mother's uplifted, beseeching hands, burst into a fit of tears. Both parents, the father naturally, had been startled out of his armchair. At first looked on with helpless amazement, and then they joined in, the father on his right side blaming the mother. She shouldn't have interfered with his sister's cleaning of the room, while on the left side yelling at his sister that she'd never be allowed to clean Gregor's room again. The mother was trying to drag the father, who was half out of his mind, into the bedroom, while the sister, shaking with sobs, pounded the table with her little fist. And Gregor hissed loudly with rage because not one of them had thought to close the door and spare him the scene and the commotions. But even if his sister, worn out by her job at the store, had gotten tired of taking care of Gregor as she once had, it wasn't really necessary for his mother to take her place so that Gregor wouldn't be neglected. For now the cleaning woman was there, this ancient widow whose powerful, bony frame had no doubt helped her through the hard times in her long life, wasn't at all repelled by Gregor. Without being the least bit inquisitive, she had once, by chance, opened the door to Gregor's room, and at the sight of Gregor, who, taken completely by surprise, began running back and forth, although no one was chasing him, stood there in amazement, her hands folded over her belly. From then on, morning and evening, she never failed to open his door a crack and peek in on him. At first, she would also call him to her, using phrases she probably meant to be friendly, such as, "Come on over here, you old dung beetle," or, "Just look at that old dung beetle." Gregor wouldn't respond to such forms of address, but would remain motionless where he was as if the door had never opened. If only this cleaning woman, instead of pointlessly disturbing him whenever she felt like it, had been given orders to clean his room every day. Once early in the morning, when a heavy rain, perhaps a sign of the already approaching spring, was beating against the window panes, Gregor became so exasperated when the cleaning woman started in with her phrases that he made as if to attack her, though, of course, in a slow and feeble manner. But instead of being frightened, the cleaning woman simply picked up a chair by the door and, lifting it high in the air, stood there with her mouth wide open. Obviously, she didn't plan on shutting it until the chair in her hands had first come crashing down on Gregor's back. "So you're not going through with it?" she asked as Gregor turned back, while she calmly set the chair down against the corner. By now, Gregor was eating next to nothing. Only when he happened to pass by the food set out for him would he take a bite, hold in his mouth for hours, and then spit most of it out again. At first he imagined that it was his anguish at the state of his room that kept him from eating. But it was those very changes to which he had quickly become accustomed. The family had fallen into the habit of using the room to store things for which there wasn't a place anywhere else. And there were many of the things now, since one room in the apartment had been rented to 3 boarders. These serious gentlemen, all 3 of them had full beards, as Gregor once noted, peering through a crack in the door, had a passion for neatness, not only in their room, but, since they were now settled in as boarders, throughout the entire apartment, and especially in the kitchen. They couldn't abide useless, let alone dirty, junk. Besides, they brought most of their own household goods along with them. This meant that many objects were now superfluous, which, while clearing without any resale value, couldn't just be thrown out either. All these things ended up in Gregor's room, and so did the ash bucket and the garbage can from the kitchen. Anything that wasn't being used at the moment was simply tossed into Gregor's room by the cleaning woman, who was always in a tremendous hurry. Fortunately, Gregor generally saw only the object in question and the hand that held it. Perhaps the cleaning woman intended to come back for these things when she had the time, or perhaps she planned on throwing them all out. But in fact, there they remained, wherever they happened to land, except for Gregor's disturbing them as he squeezed his way through the junk pile. At first, he did so simply because he was forced to, since there wasn't any other place to crawl around. But later, he took a growing pleasure in these rambles, even though they left him dead tired and sad, and they would lie motionless for hours. Since the boarders would sometimes have their dinner at home in the shared living room, on those evenings the door between that room and Gregor's would remain shut. But Gregor didn't experience the doors not being open as a hardship. In fact, there had been evenings when he ignored the open door and had lain unnoticed by the family in the darkest corner of his room. But one time the cleaning woman left the door slightly ajar, and it remained ajar when the boarders came in that evening and the lamp was lit. They sat down at the head of the table, where Gregor, his mother, and his father had sat in the old days. They unfolded their napkins and picked up their knives and forks. At once his mother appeared at the kitchen door carrying a platter of meat, and right behind her came her sister carrying a platter piled high with potatoes. The steaming food gave off a thick vapor. The platters were set down in front of the boarders, who bent over them as if to examine them before eating. And in fact, the one sitting in the middle, who was apparently looked up to as an authority by the other two, cut into a piece of meat while it was still on the platter, evidently determine if it was tender enough or whether perhaps it should be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and both mother and daughter, who'd watched anxiously, breathed a sigh of relief and began to smile. The family itself ate in the kitchen. Even so, before going to the kitchen, his father came into the living room, bowed once, and cap in hand walked around the table. The boarders all rose together and mumbled something into their beards. When they were once more alone, they ate in almost complete silence. It seemed strange to Gregor that, out of all the noises produced by eating, he distinctly heard the sound of their teeth chewing. It was as if he were being told you needed teeth in order to eat, and that even with the most wonderful toothless jaws, you wouldn't be able to accomplish a thing. Yes, I'm hungry enough, Gregor told himself sadly, but not for those things. How well these boarders feed themselves while I waste away. That very evening, during this whole time, Gregor couldn't once remember hearing the violin. The sound of violin playing came from the kitchen. The boarders had already finished their dinner. The one in the middle had pulled out a newspaper, handed one sheet each to the other two, and now they were leaning back, reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they noticed it, stood up, and tiptoed to the hall doorway, where they stood together in a tight group. They must have been heard in the kitchen, for his father called, "Does the playing bother you, gentlemen? We can stop it at once." "On the contrary," said the gentleman in the middle. "Wouldn't the young lady like to come and play in here, where it's much more roomy and comfortable?" "Why, certainly," called Gregor's father, as if he were the violinist. Soon his father came in carrying the music stand, his mother the sheet of music, and his sister the violin. His sister calmly got everything ready for playing. His parents, who had never rented out rooms before, and so were overly polite to the boarders, didn't even dare to sit down in their own chairs. His father leaned against the door, slipping his hand between the buttons of his uniform jacket, which he kept buttoned up. But his mother was offered a chair by one of the gentlemen, and leaving it where it was, he happened to place it. She sat off to one side, in the corner. His sister began to play. His father and mother on either side closely followed the movements of her hands. Gregor, attracted by the playing, had moved a little farther forward and already had his head in the living room. He was hardly surprised that recently he'd shown so little concern for others, although in the past he'd taken pride in being considerate. Now more than ever he had good reason to remain hidden, since he was completely covered with the dust that lay everywhere in his room, and it was stirred up by the slightest movement. Moreover, threads, hairs, and scraps of food clung to his back and sides. His indifference to everything was much too great for him to have gotten onto his back and rubbed himself clean against the carpet, as he had once done several times a day. And despite his condition, he wasn't ashamed to edge his way a little farther across the spotless living room floor. To be sure, no one took any notice of him. The family was completely absorbed by the violin playing. The boarders, however, who had first placed themselves, their hands in their pockets, much too close to the music stand, close enough for every one of them to have followed the score, which surely must have flustered his sister, soon retreated to the window, muttering to one another, with their heads lowered. and there they remained while his father watched them anxiously. It seemed all too obvious that they had been disappointed in their hopes of hearing good or entertaining violin playing. They had had enough of the entire performance, and it was only out of politeness that they continued to let their peace be disturbed by it. It was especially obvious by the way they blew their smoke out of their mouths and noses. It floated upwards to the ceiling, just how ill at ease they were. And yet his sister was playing so beautifully. Her face was inclined to one side, and her sad eyes carefully followed the notes of the music. Gregor crawled forward a little farther, keeping his head close to the floor so that their eyes might possibly meet. Was he an animal that music could move him so? He felt that he was being shown the way to an unknown nourishment he yearned for. He was determined to press on until he reached his sister, to tug at her skirt, and to let her know in this way that he should bring her violin into his room, for no one here would honor her playing as he would. He would never let her out of his room again, at least for not as long as he lived. At last, his horrifying appearance would be useful. He would be at every door of his room at once, hissing and spitting at the attackers. His sister, however, wouldn't be forced to remain with him. She would do so of her own free will. She would sit beside him on the couch, leaning towards him and listening as he confided that he had firmly intended to send her to the conservatory, and as if the misfortune hadn't intervened, he would have announced this to everyone last Christmas. For hadn't Christmas come and gone by now? Without paying the slightest attention to any objection. After this declaration, his sister would be so moved that she would burst into tears, and Gregor would lift himself up to her shoulder and kiss her on the neck, which, since she had started her job, she kept bare, without ribbon or collar. "Mr. Samsa!" cried the middle gentleman to Gregor's father, and without wasting another word, pointed with his index finger at Gregor, who was slowly advancing. The violin stopped. The middle gentleman, shaking his head, smiled first at his friend, and then looked at Gregor again. Instead of driving Gregor away, his father seemed to think it more important to soothe the boarders, although they weren't upset at all, and appeared to consider Gregor more entertaining than the violin playing. His father rushed over to them, and with outstretched arms tried to herd them back into their room, and at the same time blocked their view of Gregor with his body. Now, they actually got a little angry. It wasn't clear whether this was due to his father's behavior or to their drawing realization that they had had all along, without knowing it, a next-door neighbor like Gregor. They demanded explanations from his father, raised their own arms now as well, tugged nervously at their beards, and only slowly backed away toward their room. Meanwhile, his sister had managed to overcome the bewildered stare into which she had fallen when her playing had been so abruptly interrupted, and after some moments spent holding the violin and bow in her slackly dangling hands and staring at the score as if she were still playing, she suddenly pulled herself together, placed her instrument on her mother's lap — she was still sitting in her chair with her lungs heaving, gasping for breath — and ran into the next room, which the boarders, under pressure from her father, were ever more swiftly approaching. One could see pillows and blankets flying high in the air and then neatly arranging themselves under his sister's practical hands. Before the gentleman had even reached the room, she had finished making the beds and had slipped out. Once again, a perverse stubbornness seemed to grip Gregor's father, to the extent that he forgot to pay his tenants the respect still due them. He kept on pushing and shoving until the middle gentleman, who was already standing in the room's doorway, brought him up short and with a thunderous stamp of his foot. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and looking around for Gregor's mother and sister as well, "that considering the disgusting conditions prevailing in this apartment and in this family," here he suddenly spat on the floor, "I'm giving immediate notice. Naturally, I'm not going to pay a penny for this time I've spent here. On the contrary, I shall be seriously considering bringing some sort of action against you with claims that I assure you will be very easy to substantiate." He stopped speaking and stared ahead of him, as if expecting something. And indeed, his two friends chimed right in away, saying, "We're giving immediate notice too." Whereupon he grabbed the doorknob and slammed the door shut with a crash. Gregor's father, groping his way and staggering forward, collapsed into his armchair. It looked as if he were stretching himself out for his usual evening nap, but his heavily drooping head looked as if it had lost all means of support, showed that he was anything but asleep. All this time, Gregor had lain quietly right where the boarders had first seen him. His disappointment over the failure of his plan, and perhaps also the weakness caused by eating so little for so long, made movement an impossibility. He feared with some degree of certainty that at the very next moment the whole catastrophe would fall on his head, and he waited. He wasn't even startled when the violin slipped from his mother's trembling fingers and fell off her lap with a reverberating clatter. "Dear parents," said his sister, pounding the table with her hand by way of preamble, "we can't go on like this. Maybe you don't realize it, but I do. I refuse to utter my brother's name in the presence of this monster. And so all I have to say is, we've got to try to get rid of it. We've done everything humanly possible to take care of it and put up with it. I don't think anyone can blame us in the least." "She's absolutely right," said his father to himself. His mother, still trying to catch her breath, with a wild look in her eyes, began to cough, her cupped hand muffling the sound. His sister rushed over to his mother and held her forehead. His father seemed to have been led to more definite thoughts of Greet's words. He was sitting up straight and toying with his messenger cap, which lay on the table among the dishes left over from the boarders' dinner. From time to time, he would glance over at Gregor's motionless form. "We must try to get rid of it," said his sister, speaking only to her father, since her mother's coughing was so much that she was incapable of hearing a word. "It will be the death of you both. I can see it coming. People who have to work as hard as we do can't stand this constant torture at home. I can't stand it anymore either." And she burst out sobbing so violently that her tears ran down onto her mother's face, where she wiped them away mechanically with her hand. "But my child," said her father with compassion and remarkable understanding, "what should we do?" Gregor's sister could only shrug her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness that had overcome her while she wept, in contrast to her earlier self-confidence. "If he could understand us," said her father tentatively. Gregor's sister, through her tears, shook her hand violently to indicate how impossible that was. "If he could understand us," repeated her father, closing his eyes so as to take in his daughter's belief that this was impossible, "then perhaps we might be able to reach some agreement with him. But the way things are—" "He's got to go," cried Gregor's sister. "It's the only way, Father. You just have to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. Our real misfortune is having believed it for so long. But how can it be Gregor? If it were, he would have realized a long time ago that it's impossible for human beings to live with a creature like that. And he would have left of his own accord. Then we would have lost a brother, but we would have been able to go on living and honor his memory. But the way things are, this animal persecutes us, drives away our boarders. Obviously, it wants to take over the whole apartment and make us sleep in the gutter. Look, Father," she suddenly screamed, "he's at it again!" And in a panic which Gregor found incomprehensible, his sister abandoned his mother, and actually pushing herself from the chair as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than remain near Gregor, she rushed behind her father, who, startled by this behavior, got up as well, half raising his arms in front of Greet as if to protect her. Gregor hadn't the slightest desire to frighten anyone, least of all his sister. He had merely started to turn around in order to go back to his room, a procedure which admittedly looked strange, since in his weakened condition he had to use his head to help in this difficult maneuver, several times raising it and then knocking it against the floor. He stopped and looked around. His good intentions seemed to be understood. The panic had only been temporary. Now, silent and sad, they all looked at him. His mother lay in her armchair with her legs outstretched and pressed together, her eyes almost closed from exhaustion. His father and sister sat side by side, and his sister had put her arm around her father's neck. "Now maybe they'll let me turn around," thought Gregor, resuming his efforts. He couldn't stop panting from the strain, and he also had to rest from time to time. At least no one harassed him, and he was left alone. When he had finished turning around, he immediately began to crawl back in a straight line. He was amazed at the distance between him and his room, and couldn't understand how, weak as he was, he covered the same stretch of ground only a little while ago, almost without being aware of it. Completely intent on crawling rapidly, he scarcely noticed that neither a word nor an exclamation came from his family to interrupt his progress. Only when he reached the doorway did he turn his head, not all the way, for he felt his neck growing stiff, but enough to see that behind him all was as before, except that his sister had gotten to her feet. His last glimpse was of his mother, who by now was fast asleep. He was barely inside the room before the door was slammed shut, bolted, and locked. Gregor was so frightened by the sudden noise behind him that the little legs collapsed underneath him. It was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She'd been standing there, ready and waiting, and then had sprung swiftly forward before Gregor had even heard her coming. "At last!" she cried to her parents as she turned the key in the lock. "And now?" Gregor asked himself, looking around in the darkness. He soon discovered that he was no longer able to move. This didn't surprise him. Rather, it seemed to him strange that until now he'd actually been able to propel himself with these thin little legs. In other respects, he felt relatively comfortable. It was true that his entire body ached, but the pain seemed to him to be growing fainter and fainter, and soon would go away altogether. The rotten apple in his back and the inflamed area around it, completely covered with fine dust, hardly bothered him anymore. He recalled his family with deep emotion and love. His own belief that he must disappear was, if anything, even firmer than his sister's. He remained in a state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 a.m. He could still just sense the general brightening outside his window. Then, involuntarily, his head sank all the way down, and from his nostrils came his last feeble breath. Early that morning, when the cleaning woman appeared, out of sheer energy and impatience, she always slammed all the doors, no matter how often she'd been asked not to, so hard that sleep was no longer possible anywhere in the apartment when she had arrived. She didn't notice anything peculiar when she paid Gregor her usual brief visit. She thought that he was lying there so still on purpose, pretending that his feelings were hurt. She considered him to be very clever. As she happened to be holding a long broom, she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When this too had no effect, she became annoyed and jabbed it into Gregor a little. And it was only when she shoved him from his place without meeting resistance that she began to take notice. Quickly realizing how things stood, she opened her eyes wide, gave a soft whistle, and without wasting any time, she tore open the bedroom door and yelled at the top of her lungs into the darkness. "Come and look! It's had it! It's lying there, dead and done for!" Mr. and Mrs. Sampson sat up in their marriage bed, trying to absorb the shock of what the cleaning woman had given them, and yet at first unable to comprehend the meaning of her words. Then they quickly climbed out of bed, Mr. Sampson on one side, Mrs. Sampson on the other. Mr. Sampson threw a blanket over her shoulders. Mrs. Sampson wore only her nightgown. Dressed in this fashion, they entered Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door to the living room, where Greet had been sleeping since the boarder's arrival, opened as well. Greet was fully dressed, as if she had never gone to bed, and the pallor of her face seemed to confirm this. "Dead?" asked Mrs. Sampson, inquiring at the cleaning woman, although she could have checked for herself or guessed at the truth without having to investigate. "That's for sure," said the cleaning woman, and to prove it, she pushed Gregor's corpse a good way to one side with her broom. Mrs. Sampson made a move as if to stop her, then let it go. "Well," said Mr. Sampson, "now thanks be to God." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. Greet, who had never took her eyes off the corpse, said, "Just look how thin he was. It's been a long time since he's eaten anything. The food came out just as it was when it came in." Indeed, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry. This was only now obvious because the body was no longer raised on its little legs and nothing else distracted the eye. "Come to our room with us for a little while, Greet," said Mrs. Sampson with a sad smile, and Greet, not without a look back at the corpse, followed her parents into the bedroom. The cleaning woman shut the door and opened the windows wide. Although it was early in the morning, there was a certain mildness in the fresh air. After all, these were the last days of March. The 3 boarders came out of the rooms and looked around in amazement for their breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where's our breakfast?" the middle gentleman asked the cleaning woman in a sour tone, but she put her finger to her lips and then quickly and quietly beckoned the gentleman to enter Gregor's room. So they did, and with their hands in their pockets of their somewhat threadbare jackets, they stood in a circle around Gregor's corpse in the now sunlit room. At that point, the bedroom door opened, and Mr. Sampson, wearing his uniform, appeared with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. They all looked a little tearful. From time to time, Greet would press her face against her father's sleeve. "Leave my house at once," Mr. Sampson told the 3 gentlemen, pointing to the door without letting go of the women. "What do you mean?" said the middle gentleman, who, somewhat taken aback, smiled a sugary smile. The other two held their hands behind their backs and kept rubbing them together as if cheerfully anticipating a major argument, which they were bound to win. "I mean just what I say," replied Mr. Samsa, and advanced in a line with his two companions directly on the middle border. At first, this gentleman stood still, looking at the floor as if thoughts inside his head were arranging themselves in a new pattern. "Well, so we'll be off," he then said, looking up at Mr. Samsa as if suddenly overcome with humility, he was asking permission for even this decision. Mr. Samsa, his eyes glowering, merely gave him a few brief nods. With that, the gentleman, taking long strides, actually set off in the direction of the hall. His two friends, who had been listening for some time with their hands quite still, now went hopping right along after him, as if they were afraid that Mr. Samsa might reach the hall before them and cut them off from their leader. Once in the hall, the three of them took their hats from the coat rack, pulled their canes from the umbrella stand, bowed silently, and left the apartment. Impelled by his suspicion that would turn out to be utterly groundless, Mr. Samsa led the two women out of the landing. Leaning against the banister railing, they watched the three gentlemen as they marched slowly but steadily down the long staircase, disappearing at every floor when the staircase made a turn, and then, after a few moments, reappearing once again. The lower they descended, the more the Samsa's interest in them waned, and when a butcher's boy with a basket on his head came proudly up the stairs towards the gentlemen and then swept on past them, Mr. Samsa and the women quickly left the banister and, as if relieved, returned to the apartment. They decided to spend this day resting and going for a walk. Not only did they deserve this break from work, they absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table to write 3 letters excusing themselves. Mr. Samsa to the bank manager, Mrs. Samsa to her employer, and Greek to the store's owner. While they were writing, the cleaning woman came by to say that she was leaving now, since her morning's work was done. At first, the 3 letter writers merely nodded without looking up, but when the cleaning woman made no move to go, they looked up at her, annoyed. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The cleaning woman stood in the doorway, smiling as if she had some wonderful news for the family, news she wasn't about to share until they came right out and asked her to. The little ostrich feathers in her hat, which stood up nearly straight in the air and which had irritated Mr. Samsa the entire time she had worked for them, swayed gently in every direction. "What can we do for you?" asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the cleaning woman respected the most. "Well," the cleaning woman replied with such good-humored laughter that she had to pause before continuing, "you don't have to worry about getting rid of that thing in the next room. It's already been taken care of." Mrs. Samsa and Greet bent over their letters as if they intended to keep on writing. Mr. Samsa, who realized that the cleaning woman was about to go on into details, stopped her firmly with an outstretched hand. Seeing that she wasn't going to be allowed to tell her story, she suddenly remembered that she was in a great hurry. Clearly insulted, she called out, "Bye, everybody," whirled around wildly, and left the apartment with a terrible slamming of doors. "She'll be dismissed tonight," said Mr. Samsa, but without getting a reply from his wife or daughter, for the cleaning woman seemed to have ruined their tenuous peace of mind. They got up, went to the window, and remained there, holding each other tightly. Mr. Samsa turned around in his chair toward them and watched them quietly for some time. Then he called out, "Come on now, come over here. Let those old troubles alone, and have a little consideration for me too." The 2 women promptly obeyed him, hurried over, caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. Then all 3 of them left the apartment together, something they hadn't done in months, and took a streetcar out to open country on the outskirts of the city. Their car, which they had all to themselves, was completely bathed in warm sunlight. Leaning comfortably back in their seats, they discussed the prospects for the future, which on closer inspection seemed to be not so bad, since all 3 of them had jobs which, though they never asked one another about them in any detail, were in each case very advantageous and promising. Of course, the greatest immediate improvement in their situation would come quickly when they found a new apartment, one that was smaller, cheaper, and in every way easier to maintain than their current one, which Gregor had chosen for them. As they were talking on in this way, it occurred to both Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost simultaneously, as they watched their daughter become more and more vivacious, that in spite of all the recent troubles that had turned her cheeks pale, she had blossomed into a pretty and shapely girl. Growing quieter now, communicating almost unconsciously through glances, they reflected that soon it would be time to find her a good husband. And it was as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions that at the end of their ride, their daughter got up and stretched her young body. Thanks for watching. Maybe I should say thanks for listening. Eh?